Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ed Bristois. I'm the Vice President of International Trade at the Consumer Technology Association, and I'm welcoming you to our Reuters Events webinar today, Trump's Tariffs, Strategies to Strengthen Supply Chain and Procurement Operations. Uh, Look, there's no shortage of opportunity to talk tariffs these days. Tariffs are in the news every single day. It's we've not experienced a tariff environment quite like this in our lifetimes, where the United States is imposing tariffs on countries at high rates. They're imposing tariffs on specific products and sectors, on specific issues like uh, trafficking of fentanyl. So, and countries have to respond to this in their own ways, whether through negotiation or through retaliation. And all of this is incredibly dynamic, and it's difficult for even the biggest of companies to navigate such an uncertain environment. And for small businesses and mid-sized businesses, it's incredibly difficult for them to do that. And so I am really pleased to be hosting this webinar today through Reuters Events. And I've got three great speakers for you that are going to help you understand what the tariffs are all about, what you can do as a company to respond and plan and react and succeed in the future, and really how you can operate in this kind of environment from a procurement and supply chain standpoint. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves. I'll just tell you who they are, and then they can, give a short introduction, and then we're going to dive into the questions. The other aspect of this is we're going to do live polling during the webinar. And there's going to be 4 questions, and my colleagues at Reuters Events will launch those questions when I ask them to. And so we really encourage you to respond to the polling questions as we do this so we can gather data on how you're feeling about the tariffs. So first, I want to introduce Sophie Lily Weinstein. She's the advisor to the General Counsel of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and which is near and dear to my heart as a former WTO negotiator. So thank you, Sophie, for joining us today. And then we have Manuele Berdese, Vice President of Global Procurement at Thermo Fisher Scientific. And finally, Jason Schenker, who's the President and Chairman of Prestige Economics and also the Futurist Institute. And so you've got 3 incredible perspectives that you're going to learn from. And so just to say at the outset, I mean, the tariffs have caused deep uncertainty in global markets. We've got this 90-day pause for the rest of the world, a different 90-day pause for China. There's constant negotiations. We're learning more about them every day. New frameworks that have yet to be revealed. Final letters from the administration saying you got to submit your best offer or else we're going to set a higher tariff rate for you. And all of this means that companies have to take new decisions for their businesses in record time and gather the best possible information to future-proof their operations from potential downside risk. And so this webinar, hosted by Reuters Events, is going to help you understand tariff impacts, understand the supplier and facility diversification and how that fits into the picture, and then harness how you can harness emerging technologies. I just came from a Reuters event conference in Chicago this week, Supply Chain USA, and I can tell you like every single panel and every single discussion was about emerging technologies and how to use that in supply chain. So we will get into that as well. So I'm going to turn to Sophie first. Sophie, can you just help us understand who you are, how you got to be at the WTO, and what is the General Counsel? What does that mean for our audience?
I am a advisor to the General Counsel of the World Trade Organization. I'm also a member of the World Economic Forum. And the General Counsel is the highest level body within the World Trade Organization that ultimately makes decisions. They can also bring together different countries for cooperative agreements. And my job as an advisor to them, especially as an exporter, my business is in exporting, is to give them the best possible advice under whatever the next set of circumstances are geopolitically, especially as I'm also a member of the World Economic Forum and more recently the OECD as a high value policymaker. I try to provide them with the best possible counsel under whatever the circumstances may be geopolitically.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Manuele, Thermo Fisher Scientific, important company, multinational. You're responsible for procurement. What else should our audience know about you?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Ed. Leading the procurement organization in Thermo Fisher means leading from a strategic point of view, the procurement and sourcing activity in Asia, Europe, and North America. So obviously, event like what's happening on the tariff is impacting organization like ours heavily. And so the way to solve it are the strategy that we put in place. I've been in the space for more than 25 years. These are always been global. So this is not the first time that I face a situation like this one. And not in the industry, but in other elements. So really happy to be part of the conversation today to bring some perspective from a sourcing and procurement, but also operation point of view.
Thank you, Manuele. Jason, you are a futurist. You're a strategic thinker. What do you do in your various roles that I highlighted earlier? And then I'm going to ask you the first substantive question.
Course. Yeah, thank you, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Sophie and Manuele. I wear a couple of different hats. I run Prestige Economics. We're a top-ranked financial market research firm. We forecast various things in sort of the 24 to 36-month window, currency rates, macroeconomic indicators, and commodity prices. And the Futurist Institute, which I'm the chairman of, we do sort of longer-term outreach and forecasts, and I've been contributing to this dialogue for a number of years. In 2020, the Pentagon released a report. My section was titled The Nexus of Supply Chains, and thinking about how COVID would impact supply chains going forward. And in that, I outlined some of the risks of conflict between the US and China going forward. My section that I kind of illustrated that in was destined for proxy war, because most of the last 100 years or so, conflicts have been proxy wars. That's kind of how we got here. And continued that with work for National Intelligence University in a book titled World Emerging from Pandemic, and Technology and Global Supply Chain Security was my subject there. I've also authored the best-selling book, Future Proof Supply Chain. And the most recent book that I've had came out in March. I've actually been working on it for about 5 years now, Cold War II, Navigating a New Era of Uncertainty for the Economy, Finance, Energy, Technology, Trade, and Supply Chain. So this is stuff I've been working on very, very closely for a number of years. I'm also an adjunct professor for the Joint Special Operations University at US SOCOM. I was a non-resident fellow prior to that, and I'm also an advisor to the US State Department.
Well, you're in a great position then to answer the first question I have. What is the story with tariffs? How did we get here, Jason?
Oh no, Ed, this is kind of the big question people are asking. And if you look, a number of different things have happened, and there's some really great data produced by the IMF. It was released about a year ago, showed that if you look, the trade restrictions globally have been going up for a number of years. You look back 2011, 2012, there were about 300 global trade restrictions of various kinds. In 2023, it was over 3,000. So, you had in a little more than a decade, a tenfold increase in the amount of trade restrictions globally. So that's been going up. And then you add to that the tensions between the US and China. And so this is something I've been writing about for a number of years, that we are in the middle of Cold War II. And while in DC and the Beltway, people have been talking about geopolitical competition, geoeconomic competition, great power competition, that's really given way as we see the US political environment is really focused around preventing a kinetic conflict with China over Taiwan. And 2027 is the year that the House has run tabletop exercises with defense And by the way, everything I'm saying here is unclassified information with defense intel organizations. We know that the administration is working towards this 2027 goal. And of course, we look at the trade tensions inside the USMCA. A lot of this has to do with transshipments, which is basically Chinese tariff evasion. And I get it. It's kind of weird to think of President Trump as an Elliot Ness character cracking down on tax evasion, because that's what tariffs are, right? They're a tariff. But that's what we've got, right? Especially considering that in one of the debates, at least, President Trump said, I don't pay income tax. But that's because of the tax codes, right? As opposed to the fact that, tariffs, right? That this is, China is engaging in tariff evasion, essentially dumping of goods into Canada and Mexico. You take it out of the made in China box, you put it in the Hecho in Mexico box, and you send it north across the border, evading tariffs, right? This is another form of dumping of goods. Everyone in North America has known this has been going on for years. It was going to be part of the 2026 USMCA review, right? There's a sunset review of the NAFTA renegotiation, which USMCA, that was already going to come up in 2026, but 2027, when both the political parties in power, right? By actually both Democrats, Republicans, are working towards, if that's when you think China's going to make a move on Taiwan, that's 17 and a half months away. That is not a lot of time, which is why I think you've seen these trade pressures moved up. And you can see that tariffs are being used as a sword and shield of geoeconomic policy as a part of enforcing U.S. national security and projecting that. Because this is essentially, in my mind, a live fire economic drill to prevent and head off that kinetic conflict with China over Taiwan. Hopefully, in 2027, we talk again. And you know what? China hasn't made a move on Taiwan. And that's the best thing we could hope for, because that would mean maybe some of this geoeconomic posturing pushes out that risk of conflict. But what we see from the US, why is it pressuring all these other countries? It looks like, in my opinion, everything I'm saying is my opinion based on unclassified information, that what it seems is the US is trying to push on some of its greatest trading partners and allies in order to extract geoeconomic concessions to further pressure and box out China in a kind of containment that we saw in Cold War I.
Mm-hmm. It's a different type of containment compared to like what the previous administrations were doing in negotiating with allies, right?
Well, yes and no, right? I mean, this is definitely a new level of it. But if you saw in the first Trump administration, there were pressure, there were tariffs, right? The 232, the 301 tariffs, those came in under Trump 1. Under the Biden administration, those continued. There was no daylight between those two administrations. And you saw further pressuring, right? In August of 2023, out of the White House, an executive order under the Biden administration changed what Americans and American companies could do in investing in certain technologies in countries of concern. What were the restrictions? Well, US companies and citizens could not invest in AI, quantum, semiconductors, and microprocessors in countries of concern, China and the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. And so that was under the Biden administration. By the way, under the Biden administration, they raised China to a level 3 risk, which is reconsider travel because of changes in the Espionage Act that allowed for exit bans of anyone China wants, including if you're traveling with minor children from China, denied access to consular services. So, China could be like under the Biden administration, right? That this is what the State Department said. Basically, China, a great place to visit if you never want to come back. And this pressure has accelerated under the Trump administration because the timeline is now very short.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go to our first polling question. If we can bring that up, please. Okay, first polling question is how significantly have recent tariffs affected your industry or business operations? Just pick one answer. Great. Please answer if you can. We're trying to get some great data coming out of this webinar. All right, I'm going to turn to Sophie next with another question. So, look, we've been kind of looking at the bigger picture on effects of the tariffs over the last several months. Can you help the audience understand what the immediate impacts of the tariffs on global markets have been, which industries have been most affected. I think there's some really interesting data coming out of the OECD and the World Bank very recently on this.
Well, obviously it creates incredible uncertainty in the market. I think it realigns how we understand geopolitics and geopolitical trade when you have one government assert itself to the degree the United States has. The information coming out of the World Trade Organization is a very flustered level of uncertainty because they themselves don't know their own position. I think the OECD has done an excellent job of providing analysis and white papers that can be a great attribute. Because Trump keeps pushing, I'm sure we've all heard of taco, Trump always chickens out. He keeps pushing the tariffs down the line, down the line, down the line. Nobody can create a solid base, whether you're a company or you're an organization like the World Trade Organization, where you can't create a strategy or a yearly end debt quota for yourself because things keep getting pushed down the line. And as far as Trump, he's violated bylaws of the World Trade Organization. And I'm sure as a negotiator, you're very aware of this, even though the United States was the creator of the World Trade Organization. Same with the OECD. They're violating their own bylaws. Therefore, it is very, very difficult to create any type of strategy going down and assist foreign multinationals to countries.
Yeah, I think every company is going to be situated differently with respect to the tariffs, and in different industries, their exposure is different depending on where their production is, and especially when I think about things that the United States can't produce or won't be able to produce in the future, the tariffs are going to have an even greater impact. I mean, the obvious examples are bananas and coffee, but there are plenty of other examples out there as well. So, Manuele, you've been in the trenches on this at Thermo Fisher Scientific. What are some practical steps you can recommend to companies here on mitigating the risks associated with the increased tariffs or the tariff uncertainty?
Yeah, I will answer more on what I have seen in the last 25 years on situation like this one, not specifically to Thermo Fisher, because the solution that normally you apply from a procurement supply chain point of view are more or less from a strategy point of view in the same direction. So number one, in this moment is super important from a company and perspective to have a strategic sourcing approach that you need to build when situations are not such in a critical stage like this one, right? So you work very deeply on strategic sourcing activity, understand the industry that you need to monitor, understand the supplier that you have in the supply base, think about solution in advance, qualification of alternative sources, partnership with multiple suppliers in different countries. Be very focused on where you're putting your footprint, right? Because that's you are basically attracting the entire supply chain of the inbound, but also you need to think about your outbound. Is very important, is very evident in the last 20 years that you need to have a regional supply chain as much as possible, right? So we went through my automotive days 20 plus years ago when we went from a global supply chain that was very horizontal to vertical supply chain. So the North America, the Europe and Middle East, and the Asia, okay? Now, obviously, you will not benefit at any point in time of the best prices at any point in time, any moment. But when you think about total cost of ownership and the risk that you are incurring when you don't have supply chain that are vertical instead of horizontal, you're going to pay this off, right? Basically, because this situation will disrupt you. So the second point that is obviously a consequence of a good strategy understanding different industry, understanding very well your supplier base, is a supply diversification. You need to start diversify not in this moment, because in this moment you basically are going to suffer if you don't put in place a strategy of diversification, multi-qualification of supply base in different parts of the world for different sites that you might have, manufacturing operation. And together with the point number one and point number two, you need to have a strong supplier partnership, right? Because in this moment, really, you're going to benefit from the supplier that you have cultivated, that maybe have a legacy with your organization, but also suppliers that have invested in diversifying themselves, their own supply chain. Suppliers that follow you in different parts of the world from a manufacturing point of view. So you start to have suppliers that are sophisticated, right? So you need to have that strategy to move from tactical supplier to strategic supplier. Therefore, in this moment, they are with you, and they might supply goods and services from different parts of the world instead of one specific location. So they are with you, and they are going to help you to avoid any disruption from the supply chain. And then leveraging your global footprint. In many industry, you basically create the same goods and services out of multi points, right? Multi plants, multi sites. So you might produce the same goods and services in US and replicate that in Europe or replicate that in Asia. So doesn't mean that you need to have the same supplier across the globes, and therefore moving goods and shipment and logistics, you might have 3 different supply chain for your site, having the same type of goods, right? So these are normally 3-4 high-level strategies that you need to put in place, but always everything goes back to have a solid category management strategy on what you buy. So segment your basically supply base in goods and services, and really deep dive in the option that you have in a moment where there is no crisis, there is not an executive order of a tariff in the next 2 weeks, right? So you're not going to react to that, okay? You're not going to react to that if you don't do the pre-work and the homework when you have time to do it.
Right. Everybody's got to do their homework fast. So I want to launch our, we've got some feedback on our first polling question. And it looks like the tariffs have impacted businesses either like the majority is significantly or moderately. So very few, not at all, 7% so far. So, you know, that's really indicative of the broad impact, I think, that the tariffs have had on businesses, 91 respondents total. So, but Manuele's remarks here, it's a great time to launch our second polling question, which is about supplier diversification. Can we get that launched? Great. I think, excellent. We're seeing some quick feedback on this, and it looks like, Manuele, people are actively diversifying. You should write a book about that, Manuele. It's very, very logical. So I want to go to Jason, though, because I mean, imagine you have these conversations all the time about supply chain diversification with the companies you talk to. What do those conversations look like?
Yeah, I've been having this conversation with companies across industries probably since 2017, 2018, before and around the times that the Section 232 and 301 tariffs were announced, because, you know, this was becoming a hotter topic. I would say for technology and dual use companies, this is a bigger deal. So dual use technologies, or any technologies that can be used as a consumer good or as a military good. That's why it's dual use. It has 2 purposes. And so, you know, I would think, Ed, actually in your role running the Consumer Technology Association, this is a really big deal because technology is kind of at the core. And if you look at how this conflict's been evolving, you know, one of the big things that's kind of been amping up, and this didn't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, the technology transfer concerns have been there for a number of years. And if you look, China in December 2022 issued a directive in something called Document 79. This is what the Wall Street Journal has been calling the Delete A protocol, which is that the use of all American-made technology, hardware and software will be deleted from the Chinese economy. In other words, China wants to be fully technologically independent, hardware and software, of the United States. So what is then the implication going forward? Well, at some point, right, in the not too distant future, in the United States, we may find ourselves with a delete C protocol, right? This is a technological iron curtain that has been falling. And we can see this in terms of supply chains. You see, why are iPhones now being made in India? Why is Apple also bringing a lot of jobs back to the US? Well, you got to get stuff out of China, because if this technological iron curtain is falling for real, then that's going to cause a bifurcation in technological supply chains. And to Manuela's point, really important to have a diversified set of supply chains, what folks have been calling China plus one. The problem is with the idea of China plus one, that when you talk to folks who aren't Chinese, they'll tell you, well, that means we need to be able to get our supply from a country other than China. But if you talk to people who are from China, they'll say, yeah, China plus one. You can buy it directly from us or from another country we transship it through. And so this is where, looking forward, provenance is going to be a lot more important. There was a TV show back in the 80s, Canadian TV show, very popular, called You Can't Do That on Television. It was like a kid's TV show. And there was a guy who made these hamburgers. And there was always some kind of joke. Somebody'd go missing or a pet would go missing. And he'd go, well, what do you think's in the burger? Well, like, this is what the question is going to be going forward with technology. Well, you've got this laptop and it was made wherever. Okay, well, how much of it was actually made there? How much of it came from China? And so that's going to be true for laptops, tablets, any kind of hardware, any kind of software. That technological iron curtain is going to be really, really important. And I would expect you're going to see a ramping up going forward. Obviously, right now, one of the biggest challenges, you see it in the deal just struck, rare earth minerals. China has a really big monopoly on a number of those. The IMF did a report on this in late 2021, highlighting how many rare earth minerals, especially for the energy, the clean energy transition, a bunch of these for batteries, they come predominantly from China or from Russia. And that's causing a problem in these supply chains. It's a lot of leverage. It's why you've seen President Trump talk a lot about rare earth minerals in Ukraine, and why he's been talking about rare earth minerals in Greenland. Because if you're going to have an economic amputation globally that comes from a kinetic conflict between China and Taiwan, that could result in economic amputation the way Russia was economically amputated from Europe. And so if that happens, that's going to be a really, really big deal and will be much worse than what we're seeing right now with these tariffs.
Yeah, Jason, I think about this question all the time because obviously, consumer technology products are made all over the world, but they've been made in China. But it's not just a question of the finished goods; it's the inputs that go into them and where those are made and how they're made, and if you could do it at an affordable cost. But you mentioned tech. Since we're on the technology beat, I want to go to Sophie next. I mean, I speak with a lot of our small business members, and they're really struggling with how to adapt to these tariffs and the back and the forth and the tariff on, tariff off. Is technology a game changer for companies, and especially like artificial intelligence?
I think focus is hyper on AI when it should be a broad scope of Web3, which is the Internet of Things, machine learning, blockchain, AI. Everybody keeps talking about AI, but it needs to be a focus in its totality. What I recommend the viewers to do is the World Economic Forum offers they just made it was proprietary, but they just made it available to the public, an app called Strategic Intelligence. And that will help you, it involves a lot of machine learning. The World Trade Organization, even if you're a non-member, they have continuing education called MyWTO. Unfortunately, like, none of us can see into the future. So what I would think the best option is to advance your knowledge as much as possible. I just published a book on Hyperledger Fabric Chain Code, which is like a very sophisticated level of blockchain. And the more you educate yourself through this app with the World Economic Forum, again, it's a strategic intelligence app, and the World Trade Organization offers My WTO. You know, the best possible thing you could do is to educate yourself on what is blockchain. I mean, really understand what is blockchain, what is the Internet of Things, what is machine learning, what is AI in its totality, which is understood as Web3. Like, don't rely on Coinbase for your information. Try to go as much as possible to the source.
So Manuele, you're in Thermo Fisher Scientific. You may be using emerging technologies already, like AI in your procurement, your supply chain activities. Can you walk us through what you're doing today on this?
Yes. So when we think about technology, is key in this moment for a simple reason, because if you think about the problem that we are trying to solve from an operation point of view and supply chain point of view, is very rational and logic what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to minimize the cost, the impact, without disrupting the supply chain. And normally this means that you need to work through your normal processes to find the solution that is optimal and different than the one that you had before. So basically, what you have when you have processes, you have different data points that you need to connect to come out with some solution. When you have data points, you have a data landscape, a data ecosystem. And when you have a data ecosystem, you can leverage AI, right? So an example, if we need to change the supply flow of a material that is partially made in China and then assembled in Vietnam, and then there is a trade transaction in Singapore, and then coming through Mexico, and then finally arriving to US. If you have mapped your supply chain with the data real point in time, then you can model before moving the goods what is the best way possible to change the supply chain of these different components. For example, going back to the laptop example that Jason had, right? And you can decide when you have multiple sources to not to buy all the components from China or Singapore, but having the same components with your multi-qualification supplier in a region that could be maybe made in the States later on, right? Or made in Europe, where Eastern Europe, where maybe the tariffs are lower than China, right? So you can play all these different scenarios with your supply chain. At the end of the day, is a process. And when you have a process, you have data, and then when you have data, you can apply a layer of technology on top of that. The minimum common denominator is data, right? If you don't have the data, you cannot apply any technology on top of it. So your data strategy is key, and normally these are solutions that the big organization and the organization that look forward with a technology roadmap they have as a layer, a fundamental layer, like what is our data strategy, the normalization of the information that then we can use to run model. So natural process languages, ML and so on, they run on data, right? So you need to do the hard work to create a landscape that then you can use. And when you have goods moving across the world, you need to have bill of material. You need to understand exactly where the materials are coming from, not as a finished good, but as a sum of different components on services from different countries. So country of origin data, all that is information that you need to have to move the supply chain at a certain point with a certain agility. Who has done this work on a technology, from a technology point of view and process point of view, then we'll have an advantage moving forward, because we'll be able to maneuver with agility the supply chain, even in a short period of time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like the last couple of days when I was at the Reuters Events conference in Chicago, when we were talking about data, it was clear that there's a lot of companies who are still in the spreadsheet phase of managing their supply chains, and there's others that are adopting agentic AI to help them with not just like managing their data, but like turning that data into actionable recommendations and outcomes. I mean, that's kind of like the next step.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm a big fan of data analytics, and in the industry for a while, the first thing that you need to have is descriptive data analytics, right? So that is the first point, and you need to start to have a prescriptive and then predictive. But you don't go to wave 2 and wave 3 if you don't do the descriptive analytics as a layer at the beginning, right? So the spreadsheet can be transformed in data repository and data lakes that you can use later on. The AI itself is not going to solve your problem of the data if you don't have the data, but if you have the data, you can use AI to solve your equations.
Jason, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Manuel is making a great point, which is, look, a lot of folks, there is a lot of opportunity for AI and agentic AI and lots of opportunities, but it all comes back to the data. How good is the data you have? And sometimes a spreadsheet is enough. Like, it depends how many SKUs you've got, but if the data is good, that's the priority, right? Because if you have bad data, garbage in, garbage out, hallucinations, and then it might turn out to be worthless. So this is the other thing. Plus, depending on which kind of AI you're using, you may not want to dump your company data into a public AI, right? This, because then it becomes part of the whole and it's lost. This isn't like an anchovy on a Caesar salad where you can like pick the anchovy back off again. This is like paprika in a goulash. It's everywhere and you're never getting the paprika back out again. So your data, your IP, your patents, your vendor names, your supply chain info, dumping that into a public agentic AI, that's very, very risky. And I've talked to a lot of companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, where they're wondering what they can do with AI. And sometimes, you know, the spreadsheet's enough. It just depends what you're trying to do with it, as long as the data's good.
Manuele, do you have a response there?
Yeah, there is a very good point, Jason. I think that if we only had 50% of the data that we need, but the good quality on the 50%, we can make something out of it.
Yeah.
Right? What you don't want to do is thinking that with synthetic data augmentation of your data that you have right now, you can solve a problem. You're going to generate actually more solution based on synthetic data that are not based on reality, and therefore solution that has nothing to do with your database. So you need to do the hard work first. That is, whatever you have it, just make sure that is well organized, clean, and then you build from it. So then you inject the synthetic data, you go forward, right? But I think that you're spot on.
Well, this is a perfect opportunity to launch our third question. So can we bring that up? Leveraging technology. How effectively is your organization using emerging technologies like AI to address supply chain disruptions?
You know, Ed, if I can jump in on
Sure.
one thing, I also want to say, because, you know, Sophie had mentioned blockchain, and I think this is really important because, you know, I know people think of blockchain as cryptocurrencies, or they think about it as NFTs, the artwork and the board apes, but hold on. But the thing is, one of the highest value uses of blockchain in this kind of environment could be doing a marking of goods that are in the supply chain to ensure provenance, to match it with imaging and bills of lading. And you have these systems. We've done a JV with a company called Secure Marking on this topic. You know, there is a way to get more transparency. So if we're thinking about getting back to what Manuel is talking about, the data piece, this is where the blockchain adds value as a kind of accounting software that you can match with goods provenance.
No, I completely agree. There's a great book by Pack Publishing called Tokenization of Assets that really is in line with supply chain, especially transparency, security, etc. And I think that the focus on blockchain being for payment is unfortunate, because blockchain really is like a universal utility. It's the new electric grid. And I think this hyper focus on payment distracts from the possibility, especially in supply chains, where smart contract. I mean, right now people are using paper. DP Logistics just went paperless, and they see 10% of global trade. For as long as customs officials are using paper, you're going to have this back jam. I'm sure everybody remembers during COVID and there being 128 cargo ships trying to get into the port of LA. A lot of that had to do with the fact that it was an electronic. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And blockchain, especially smart contracts, can really tighten up those costs. And what everybody's saying about AI can be then applied to what we know and apply it to blockchain so it can be much more efficient. And because ultimately with these tariffs, if we can cut costs in different areas, that is to everybody's benefit.
Well, it looks like from the poll, we had 75 respondents on this one. The majority, slight majority, well, 57%, not effectively, not using it all in terms of leveraging technology. Only 9% of the respondents very effectively. So it seems like there's a lot more room to run here. I think a lot more education is involved, and just people being willing to experiment, but also doing it in a secure and safe way, as you mentioned, Jason. So I want to talk about trade policy, because as a trade policy practitioner who works on supply chains, it's two sides of the same coin. Supply chains are all about trade, and trade policy has a definite impact on how companies build their supply chains. And I want to emphasize that supply chains are built by companies, not by governments, first of all. So, Sophie, you're talking directly to the WTO. You've got experience with the World Economic Forum. What's the trade policy conversation like right now, and how can really businesses, in your view, adopt strategies that can ensure their long-term resilience against future trade policy changes?
This is a difficult question to answer, only because the chaos within. So what I would recommend is that people when they look at their business organization, I would adapt macroprudential and microprudential economic principles, because I think this shows how fragile the global trade really is, how one person can come in and mess it up for so many different people. The conversation, it's impossible to have any type of succinct conversation, because keep pushing the goalpost. And if you keep pushing the goalpost, you create greater uncertainty. Like with the recent agreement between China and the United States and London, we've just pushed the goalpost again. So you can't create a strategy. But I think if companies ensure that they are compartmentalized and use macro and microprudential economic policies, so that if one part of your business gets hit by a shock to the market, it doesn't create a domino effect.
Manuele, I mean, imagine you're thinking about trade policy a lot as well, and talking with your colleagues internally in Thermo Fisher about this. I mean, do you have like a war room, kind of battle room approach to respond to the trade policy changes? Because I've heard that from other companies.
Yes, it's been a challenge to put in place a strategy other than mitigation right now, right? Because the intensity of the information that are coming through, for example, what was two weekends ago, I think there was an announcement on Friday, and then there was a change already on Sunday, right? So what you do is you try to understand on what is going to stick around in terms of tariff for the long run, right? And put together strategy around that, right? But you don't want to overreact right now, because maybe the situation is going in 6 months or after the 9th of July, for example, with Europe. maybe is changing again, right? So you try to mitigate as much as you can right now. And right now there is a lot of effort right now to get also increase the level of shipments, right? June and July to save the quarters and so on. So many people are, but those are tactical moves, right? So strategic wise, you need to budget for something that is going to stick in the similar way that was done in the previous the first round of the administration, right? When we had the tariff section 232 on steel and aluminum at the time, and those tariffs are still there, right? So the tariffs,
50% now.
right, and now it went from 25 to 50, but there was a moment that were 25. So the strategy that you put in place there, more or less, will have to continue extrapolate also for now, but is very short term right now. Is mitigation more than long term strategy. Mitigation this year, hopefully, right? Stabilize a little bit, and then because you might make a mistake, you might make a move that doesn't make any sense. There are also industries, to be honest, that are only exclusively in China right now. So even if you want to create a different scenario, that you can not really move out of certain industry. So there would you need to budget and figure out a diversification of your product, probably, right? More than changing the source or the country of origin.
Right. If it's about the US market. I mean, there's the rest of the
Yes.
world which might be operating in a different set of assumptions, right? Like there might be more stability outside the United States in terms of trade regimes, compared to what's happening with the administration at the moment.
Yes.
Yes. Jason, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think what comes next to Manuele's point is more uncertainty. And I think there's a few things to consider. In the United States, there seems to be a lot of division right now, but there's one issue Americans agree about, and that's China. A Pew Research poll from March showed 77% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. Similar YouGov polls have shown around 80% of Americans view China as the enemy. In 2012, it was 40%. So that's been a really big shift in the same way that global trade restrictions have shifted. So while uncertainty of policy lies ahead, that conflict between the US and China is likely to continue grinding on. And this is where I tend to talk to executives and boards about futurist frameworks, right? So having been a consultant and working in investment banking, most folks are probably familiar with those kinds of forecasts, which are mid case, high case, low case. Futurists think about things in a different way. They think about four futures as kind of a common way to think about it. So if we think about geopolitics, what are the four futures? Well, one of these is a plateau. That is, you have a trend going on and it just stops and it freezes where it is, and that's a plateau. It's a scenario, but given how uncertainty things are, do you think things could freeze the way they are right now? Seems kind of unlikely at this point.
No.
Another scenario is the reversal. Do you think suddenly things could reverse? What would you need to believe? You'd need to believe, what does this look like? Well, it would look like Putin and Zelensky and Xi and Trump sitting around a campfire making s'mores singing Kumbaya. It would result in re-globalization and an opening of trade. It's a scenario, but it's not a very likely one. And then there's two other scenarios. One is a continuation. That's Cold War II, where the tensions between the US and China keep ramping up. But there's a worse scenario, which is the acceleration, and that something goes wrong. And by the way, because you have this rising tension, what are the odds somebody does the wrong thing, makes the wrong move, someone in an operations situation, it causes things to escalate, and that's World War III. And while we think about the costs of the tariffs as being high, imagine what would happen to the costs in the global economy if what happened with Russia, right, all the sanctions that went on Russia when they invaded Ukraine. Imagine what kinds of costs there would be to the global economy if China blockades Taiwan, right? Because when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, and China has the biggest navy in the world. What happens? And they've been doing these drills. They did one In May of last year, they called it Joint Sword Operation 2024A. That's what the Chinese named it. You don't need to be a good forecaster to know it's probably going to be a B, right? And that happened in October, Joint Sword 2024B. Again, you had a joint force blockade, more or less, of Taiwan, and then it went away. So they're demonstrating this sort of like with what we're demonstrating with the tariffs in the US. This is a live fire drill where you're showing what you could do. And the question is, what happens if China just doesn't go away one of those times? What will the cost be? And to put this in perspective, you know, in the last year of the Second World War, the United States spent 40% of its GDP on military and defense. And so that's a lot. Today, 40% of US GDP would be about $12 trillion. And so even though the US has a big military budget around $1 trillion, it's a lot less than 12. And so anything you can do to avoid that hot kinetic conflict is going to be a high priority activity. And I think looking at those kind of 4 futures scenarios, a continuation is probably the best case scenario we can hope for in the immediate term.
Well, one other data point I'll cite here is that public opinion in the United States about the use of tariffs has been souring. You can see that I think compared to last year, there might have been more interest in the use of tariffs, and now, you know, definitely over 50% of Americans are, at least in terms of the polling I've seen, they don't believe that putting high tariffs on imports is a good idea. But you know, that's whether public opinion influences the political process is a different matter, and I think that's the open question. Sophie, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, last year I don't think people really understood what tariffs were. I think it was.
That's
I
right.
think I really don't think they realized the implication of what they were voting for. Like through the World Trade Organization, they have like advanced learning. So I was doing my tariff homework, and I was looking at it, I was like, there's no way Trump knows what he's talking about. Like, this is just beyond this is over his head. This is like, I don't think people really realize what they were getting themselves into. It sounded good, isn't actually good. 2 totally different things.
Well, look, we've got just a couple minutes left, and I just have one more question before we get into some of the audience questions for you. And I think you should feel free to weigh in on this. What trends do you see in global trade policies, and how should businesses prepare? And you know, I'll just offer my personal perspective, and I'm sort of with Jason on this, is like the continuation and, you know, increasing uncertainty, maybe not acceleration, but um, let's see. We haven't heard from Manuele in a bit. So Manuele, do you want to jump in?
I think that honestly, what we see right now, geopolitically, probably is going to stay for a little bit. That's my personal take, and so I would recommend for people in the field, managing supply chain in my case, or procurement, not to waste this opportunity to get ready to set up a good strategy for your supply chain in a way that when the next increase of tariff or the Cold War could start again and we had some disruption, you are ready, right? So the people that did the exercise when Section 232 came up back in what was 2011, 13, okay? And the time I was the second biggest buyer of steel in North America. So I remember that was very painful, the impact. But the company that did that at that moment right now are the same company that they can manage cost with their supply chain in US, managing the same goods, right? So that exercise, that work is going to pay off in the long run. Strategy will always pay off in the long run, right? So you need to be ready to absorb the shocks in the from a company perspective, and so continue to work on the strategy that you have, accelerate that, get ready, because I don't think this is going away, right? in
Yeah,
a very not in the next 4 years.
Section
For sure.
232 tariffs are defoally not going away. There was a question about this in
Right.
the chat.
I
And
don't even think that
not
in the
going away.
next, to be honest, in the next foreign policies, even if in the next administration, US administration or European,
Mhm.
will change. I have seen that going from 2 legislation ago to the previous one to this one. When the tariff goes in, stays in for the long run, right?
That's right.
And
That's right.
so there is no point not to put in place a strategy right now to do it in the right way and de-risk your situation. Working on this element that we just said, right? So that is understanding how to avoid the tariff, cost efficiency, supply chain resiliency, access to different market, diversification of the footprint, supply chain stability, market flexibility with your inbound and outbound. So you need to work on those elements for the next for the mid and long term.
Well, thank you, Manuele. We have one more polling question that I want to get to. And can we please bring that up on future outlook? How prepared do you feel your organization is for future changes in global trade policies? I'm excited about this one. Let's see. Kind of in the middle. Somewhat prepared, slightly prepared, kind of taking the day. So, I think the uncertainty is hard. It makes it hard for people to prepare ultimately, because they're constantly changing their perspectives based on what we're seeing in the policy environment. So, we're almost at time. I want to give each of you an opportunity to provide one more recommendation or call to action to our audience. And I'm going to start with Jason, then we'll go to Manuele and finish off with Sophie.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ed. It's been a great pleasure being on this panel. The one thing I'd encourage you to think about is this is a longer term issue. Most historians today look at World War I and World War II as one conflict with a 20-year armistice to answer what's called the German question. How do you resolve Germany's propensity for military, economic, and political hegemony over Europe? Cold War I and Cold War II, I would argue, are two parts of the same conflict with a 50-year armistice. In February of 1972, there was Nixon's China moment. Nixon and Kissinger drive a wedge between China and Russia. Nixon shaking hands with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, on the tarmac. And that deal was bought with the One China policy. 50 years to the month, China and Russia issue a joint statement in February 2022, February 4, 2022, from the Olympics in Beijing. And they say they strongly defend the outcomes of the Second World War. Totally normal to say in the mid-1900s, really weird to say in 2022, and there is no limit to their cooperation. Thinking back to Cold War I, when I was raised in the 1970s, Russia was the big thing people were concerned about. But if we think about Cold War I, where did it go hot? It went hot not in Russia's periphery, it went hot in Korea, in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, in China's periphery. Maybe Cold War I and Cold War II are two parts of the same conflict with a 50-year armistice to answer the China question. How do you resolve China's propensity for military, economic, and political hegemony over Asia? If you believe that this is a real thing, that should drive how you think about your supply chains going forward. And I would argue this is the conflict that will likely dominate the decades ahead. Because in order to believe that's not an issue, you'd have to believe that China doesn't want Taiwan to be incorporated into the country.
Mhm.
So that's my final thought.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jason. Manuele.
Yes, I'm going to repeat that it is important to continue to focus on an agile supply chain strategy. So basically, continue the diversification of that supply base, reduce dependency on specific country, specific suppliers as well. Work on the partnership with the supplier that have the opportunity to drive you in different parts of the world, and eliminate and basically limit logistic cost and transportation, but also focus on localization to mitigate future risk associated with, like we said, international trade policy. And the other thing is work closely with your clients to ensure the supply base really help them, right? Because that's the key. At the end of the day, everybody has an end consumer and client, and the clients have all the interest to work with you as a partner, being a supplier or a supplier of a supplier, to find a solution altogether. At the end of the day, when you align at this data point and this is different interest from a business point of view, the solution is there, right? So if we cannot solve it alone, then we partner with someone who should solve it alone. Can be the client, can be the supplier, but everybody wants to stay in the business and be profitable and make sure that shareholders and stakeholders are happy with the results. Therefore, a solution will be found because everybody has the same interest.
Thank you, Manuele. That alignment is key across the supply chain, across vendors and suppliers. So appreciate that perspective. And Sophie, please close us out.
I agree with everything Jason was saying. I think he said it very succinctly. I would probably just reiterate to the audience that there are resources through the World Economic Forum, through the World Trade Organization, that can help align your business and the needs of your business, especially as the geopolitical waters keep shifting. But I completely agree with what Jason said. I think this is going to be going on for the foreseeable future. Let's say the next 10 years. Jason would like 10 years, 2 administrations, and he's right. They just continue on. So I would agree with that. So staying agile and stay up to date. And there's no better source than the actual source. So I encourage people to utilize those resources that are available.
Yeah, and the one thought I'll also offer to businesses is, working for an industry association, participate in your industry associations, join them, use government affairs resources. I mean, all of this is critical to work with governments around the world, to operate the WTO or the OECD or the World Economic Forum. These are things that companies also need to do just to manage the uncertainty. So I'd like to thank Sophie, Manuele, and Jason for just providing incredible insights to our audience and perspectives and helping them navigate the next 10 years, so to speak. And I'd like to thank Reuters Events for inviting us all to participate in this webinar today. And I'd like to thank our audience for being here and for your contributions as well. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.